to introduce the UN Special Rapporteur now, and then invite him to make his remarks. So for those who are not familiar, Mr. Clément Boulet is the appointed UN Special Rapporteur on the rights to freedom of peaceful assembly and of association, a mandate that he's held since April 2018. And prior to his appointment, he led the International Service for Human Rights work to support human rights defenders from states in transition, and also coordinated ISHR's work in Africa as the advocacy director. He also served as the Secretary General of the Togolese Coalition of Human Rights Defenders, a campaigner for the Togolese Coalition for the ICC, and Secretary General of the Amnesty International section in Togo. So with that, I will turn it over to Special Rapporteur Boulet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julie. I want just first to greet all of those who are joining us from online, but also all my fellow panelists for really being here to discuss these important issues. Let me also thank ICNL for inviting me to this important side event, but also for their remarkable work on issue of access to resources, and also their support for civil society to trying to overcome some of those challenges in restrictive environments. As you know, under the international laws, the right to freedom of association, as enshrined in Article 20 of the Universal Declaration and Article 20 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, not only protect the rights to form and join an association, but also to seek, resecure, and use resources from domestic, foreign, and international sources. So states have therefore the positive obligation to promote and facilitate access to funding by civil society as part of their duty to create and maintain a safe and enabling environment. The rights of association to access to funding is essential not only to the exercise of the association itself, or the existence of the association itself, but also the realization of other human rights, such as the achievements of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the COVID Resilience and Recovery Plan. Despite its recognition in international human rights norms and standards, the rights of civil society to access funding, particularly foreign funding, is under serious threats. It is this context that I dedicated my 2021 report to the Human Rights Council to the right to access resources. In my reports, for example, I noted that civil society organizations are being subjected to more and more laws, regulation, and practices put in place to control rather than enable access to funding. Regrettably, instead of modifying or improving existing law and practice in line with international human rights norms and standards, many states are expanding restriction and creating an increasing complex environment for civil society to access to financial resources in violation of the right to freedom of association. Many of these measures directly targeted foreign funding or are the result of the over-regulation of civil society sector driven by the counterterrorism and anti-money laundering policies or law. Despite some of improvements by the FATF regulation and then also the recent consultation with civil society to improve FATF recommendation, the reality is that the anti-money laundering regulation and measure to counter terrorism financing continue to have a negative impact on civil society right to access resources. We have also seen states' abuse of counterterrorism and national security measure to further limit the space for civil society to operate, including through the arbitrary designation of NGO as a terrorist or foreign agent. In some countries, these measures have often being introduced ahead of election and or in response to the prominent protest movements. Other measures restricting civil society access to resources include smear campaign and judicial harassment against foreign-funded civil society. India, for example, has not only kept in place the 2010 contribution framework, despite the criticism from NGOs, my mandate, and international community, but has also increased restriction with the amendment to the law made in 2020. Foreign-funded NGOs are being criminalized and closed in the Philippines, for example. In Thailand, the proposed NPO bill will force many human rights organizations to close and negatively impact many regional organizations based in Thailand working on development and humanitarian issues, particularly in the Myanmar context. Civil society around the world are impacted by issue of access to financial services, inordinate delay in cash transfers, onerous due diligence requirements, inability to open bank accounts, and arbitrary closure of bank accounts, collectively classed as de-risking activity by financial institutions. All of these alarming trends tend to affect social and grassroots movements in particular, and we continue to follow them with great concern as we are receiving a lot of submission around the state's or banking behavior when it comes to the access to the resources by civil society. I recognize that many states may have legitimate reason, including genuine commitment to preventing the financing of terrorism, to oversee and regulate the flow of financial transactions in their jurisdiction, including those carried out by civil society. However, states should demonstrate that such measure met each of the requirements of the Article 22.2 of the ICCPR, legality, legitimate, objective, and necessity and proportionality. A great majority of the measures adopted by the states across the world that my mandate assess failed to meet this test. Often, they have been used to silence, intimidate, or harass human rights organizations. As a result, in many countries, civil society organizations have been forced to reduce their operation, readjust their activity, or simply close. Civil society organizations advancing the rights of marginalized groups, including women and LGBTI persons, are especially affected since they are often highly dependent on foreign funds to support their activity. The impacts of these measures go beyond the financial sustainability of the affected organization and directly affect the community that civil society organizations serve. For example, these measures have prevented civil society organizations to contribute to alleviate the suffering of many in need of humanitarian assistance. In my report, I also explain how the impact of this restriction is intensified by some donor practices that continue to serve as a barrier to access to funding. For example, some donor grant-making processes and administrative requirements, particularly those of bilateral donors, continue to be complex and onerous, excluding many organizations and increasing civil society financial fragility. Donor practices also continue to favor short-term funding and perpetuate unequal power relation between civil society organizations in high-income countries and those in low middle-income countries. My mandate remains committed to finding instances of best practice of state, donor, and other relevant actors. We should also make sure to use these trends and ripple effect to our advantage by learning from each other across the country and regional lines. As we witness states using similar technique to further restrict civil space, we have to join force in defending it. New and strong alliances need to be created. Through collecting examples of good or promising practice for the promoting and protecting of the ability of or right to civil society to access funding, we can promote such practice which could then be used in other countries and other contexts. Protecting civil society and their right to access resources is protecting their communities and ultimately serving the interests of the states. Shifting certain narrative and other smear campaign against civil society is an essential part of the protection of the right to freedom of association, but also to protect civil society access to resources. Civil society organizations are and remain a vital and necessary backbone of many services that are provided to different parts of the society, especially the marginalized and disenfranchised groups. We need to do a better job of highlighting these aspects of civil society work, because only then will big parts of our nation and society to realize, we can bring them to realize that this is a direct, that the restriction of civil society access to funding is a direct attack of the service that civil society provide to them. And also, in general, the attack of their participation, which is core of any democracy. If we achieve this, then we will achieve the defense and hopefully even further opening civic space. So this is why, to conclude, my mandate started since I present this report to the Human Rights Council, working on a set of guidelines in order to help states to enable civil society access to funding. And this guideline also aim also to advise donor, multilateral donor, foundation, but also civil society on how to overcome the challenge today that is posed by the access to the right to access to funding for civil society. So this guideline, as I start already doing it, I'm consulting with some of you, and I will be doing, and my objective is to be able to present this guideline during the upcoming session in June at the Human Rights Council here in Geneva. So I'm really looking forward to our exchange today in order to help me also to see how I can use some of your funding or your recommendation in my work, but also how we can work together to try to push back these restrictions that we are seeing emerging everywhere, but also to make sure that states understand the value of allowing or enabling civil society to access to resources as essential for civil society to carry out his work in the country. So let me stop here and thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to our exchange.
Thank you very much, UN Special Rapporteur Boulay. Very meaningful remarks and important, global look at the impact of these restrictions on not just the CSOs themselves, but the communities that they serve. So again, we very much appreciate your remarks and your work on all this, on these topics. With that, I'm going to introduce our report authors and turn it over to them for a presentation. First, we'll have Dr. Natalie Silver, who is a senior lecturer at the University of Sydney Law School, where her research focuses on not-for-profit law and regulation, and in particular, the tax aspects of charitable giving and the regulation of cross-border philanthropy. Natalie is also a director of the Charity Law Association of Australia and New Zealand. And then we'll have Dr. Natasha Belendra, who is an independent consultant who focuses on international human rights, child rights, and governance issues. Natasha is the former executive chairperson of the National Child Protection Authority of Sri Lanka, and she currently sits on the board of Shanti Margam, an NGO which works with children and adolescents with the goal of breaking cycles of violence in communities. So I will turn it over now to Natalie. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Julie. I'm just going to share my screen. Everybody can see the screen now? Yes, good.
Yes.
Great. Thank you. Thanks to Julie and ICNL for having us and for all of their support with this important project. We very much appreciate it. Thanks also to the UN Special Rapporteur for your insightful comments on this important topic. We'd also just like to thank, in particular, our 3 research assistants who provided an enormous contribution to this report, Kirana Anjani, Meghna Sharma, and Prashant Singh. So thank you to them. But probably most importantly, we're really grateful and thankful to all of the organizations who have contributed to this report. And these organizations are not named in the report. And the reason for that is really because of the sensitivity of the information regarding foreign funding restrictions in the countries that we surveyed. So they're not named, but they know who they are, and we thank them all for their contributions. So you've already heard from the Special Rapporteur about the issue of foreign funding restrictions impacting cross-border philanthropy. In terms of our specific report and what we were trying to achieve here was we were trying to examine the impact of the regulatory and legal and informal measures used to restrict foreign funding of NGOs during the pandemic. And we were focusing in particular on the Indo-Pacific region. So we looked at 9 countries. We looked at Bangladesh, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, Nepal, Pakistan, the Philippines, Sri Lanka, and Thailand that represented many countries in the region. And our research focused in particular on, we had specific questionnaires, country-based, that we developed and that we then sent to NGOs across a range of programmatic areas in the different regions. So we had NGOs involved focused on areas of employment, environment, health, education, democracy and government, human rights, so across a whole range of areas, plus service organizations and advocacy organizations. So we really tried to cover many bases here in terms of the research. We followed up these questionnaires once we got our responses with in-depth interviews with organizations in each of the 9 countries. So those interviews tended to be with executive directors of the organizations, because really we were getting quite a high level of information from those people. So we had 5 research questions but that we focused on and that we were looking for findings in relation to these questions. So firstly, we were looking at what laws and regulations are actually impacting the ability of NGOs to receive and use foreign funds in these 9 countries. And then outside of these formal laws and regulations, what other informal political or other pressures were impacting organizations in those countries? We focused in particular on the extent to which and the manner in which the formal and informal restrictions have impacted the work of NGOs. And particularly, we wanted to know what was occurring during COVID-19, during the pandemic. Similarly, we wanted to know whether there was a result, as a result of these restrictions, whether there was a loss of foreign funds for NGOs, particularly again during the pandemic. Finally, we were concerned with whether or not there has been a broader chilling effect on NGOs in the region. So in order to answer these questions, we first had to undertake research on the existing laws and regulations in each of the 9 countries that we were surveying. And the next slide here shows you, it's really a snapshot actually of these formal restrictions in each of the 9 countries. So I'll explain what you're seeing here on this chart. You've obviously got the different countries down the side here, but we categorized the restrictions into 6 different categories, and that is what these symbols here represent. So the first category we looked at, and we compared these across the different countries, was the registration requirements existing in those countries that affected foreign funding. We looked at whether or not there were prior government approvals for receiving or using foreign funds. We focused on the cancellation of registration. This was particularly important in India, and the penalties for non-compliance associated with foreign funding. And then we looked at restrictions on particular activities that can be undertaken with foreign funds. So, for example, in India, again, subgranting of money that had been received outside of India was a restricted activity. We looked at reporting requirements for foreign funding, and finally, restrictions on an organization's operations as a result of foreign funding. And that included requirements that foreign funds are channeled through certain bank accounts, or that administrative expenses for foreign funds were capped. So this affected a number of the countries that we looked at. Now, after we'd categorized these, we then, and will explain these two tables here, we focused on, were there laws and restrictions that specifically or explicitly targeted the receipt and use of foreign funds? And what we found, and this will be of no surprise to most of you on the call, is that in India, with the FCRA, there was obviously, each of these categories has been specifically targeted by that legislation. So it affected all categories. But similarly, in both Bangladesh and in Pakistan, all of the categories have got specific laws or regulations targeting the receipt and use of foreign funds. Now, you'll see here that this second table is not about specific laws and regulations, but rather general laws and regulations that apply to NGOs receiving foreign funding, not specifically targeting foreign funding, but which nonetheless have an impact on NGOs who do receive and use foreign funds. And so here, some of the countries that, for example, Malaysia and Sri Lanka, which have no specific laws and regulations restricting foreign funding, but they instead do have some general laws that nonetheless impact organizations which receive foreign funds. And then you'll see in other countries, there's sort of a combination of both here. But one of the things that we found here when we looked at these laws and regulations was that, and this may not be surprising to you, is that the countries of Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan, who did have these specific laws and regulations targeting the receipt and use of foreign funds, they tended to have, those laws and regulations had the most severe impact on organizations in those countries. So a very specific and severe impact. Now, that is not to say that countries like Malaysia and Sri Lanka, without the laws and regulations specifically targeting foreign fundings, had no impact. What seemed to happen in those countries is it wasn't so much the laws and regulations having the impact, but rather that there were informal measures instead impacting NGOs' ability to receive and use foreign funds. So we, again, as well as these formal measures, we did look at the formal laws and regulations. We did look at informal measures as well, including political pressure, harassment, and intimidation. And we've got a list here of those measures. But the idea is that in most countries, these tended to operate alongside the formal restrictions, although, as I said, in some countries, like Malaysia and Sri Lanka, informal measures are used actually much more extensively than the laws and regulations themselves. And these ranged from, being labeled a Western agent, threats to investigate or audit an organization, pressure to repurpose funds. In India in particular, threats of deregistration were very common, but it even rose to the level of physical surveillance and imprisonment and physical attacks. And it was the Philippines in particular that really had the most extreme measures, informal measures, of all of the countries that we looked at. In particular, in the Philippines, this included red tagging, where organizations are essentially blacklisted by the government and often, accused of undertaking terrorist activities, of being anti-national. And at its most extreme in the Philippines, this did result in extrajudicial killings. So quite significant informal measures, as I said, operating alongside those formal laws and regulations. But I will now hand it over to Natasha, who is going to talk about our more specific findings. We had a number of specific findings as well. So I will stop sharing my screen, and Natasha will allow you to continue.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to quickly jump into the findings. Okay, so our first finding, everyone can see the screen, right?
Yes.
Okay, so our first finding was that even laws that might at first glance seem to be more about technical requirements rather than outright restrictions. So for example, registration requirements, prior approvals, reporting requirements, even these in practice are being implemented in a very onerous and heavy-handed manner and are having a negative impact on the work of NGOs. So for example, our data showed that 44% of respondents said that these registration requirements were having a severe or very severe impact on them. Now, what do we mean by harsh implementation of these requirements? So registration requirements, for example, at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, these requirements created huge obstacles for NGOs that were providing services. This was especially the case in India, where not only were unregistered, were NGOs unable to get FCRA registration and therefore were unable to access funds, but the government of India severely restricted the renewal of registration as well. Prior approvals also are being implemented in a harsh manner. For example, in Pakistan during COVID, the Pakistan, when an NGO receives foreign funding, they have to enter into a MOU with the government. And this entails a severe investigation from the government where law enforcement authorities enter NGOs and question and take photos of the staff of NGOs. Reporting requirements, again, though they exist in many countries, are being implemented in an onerous manner in certain countries beyond kind of the bureaucratic burden. For example, in Sri Lanka, the reporting requirements are sometimes used by officials to pressure NGOs to engage in certain types of work and not in other types of work. In the Philippines, we were told that information that is included in these reports are sometimes shared with the police and the military. So, sorry, I need to share. Okay. So our second finding was that restrictions increased even during COVID, as Julie said. So during the pandemic, governments struggled to provide essential services, and NGOs actually had to move in and fill those gaps. And governments, like the Indian government, explicitly asked for NGOs to help, and NGOs stepped in, and this was across the region. They stepped in to provide food and medicine, to provide health messaging, and to support women and children. But somehow this didn't stop the governments from increasing restrictions. So as we said in India, in the middle of the first wave of COVID, the FCRA was suddenly amended and additional restrictions, such as restrictions on subgranting, restrictions on administrative expenses, etc., were brought in. In Pakistan too, although the restrictions were eased temporarily in April 2020, they were reinstated soon after, and new restrictions were brought in via the 2021 and 2022 NGO policies. In the Philippines, during COVID, the Anti-Terrorism Act was fast-tracked, and this was then weaponized during COVID for purposes of red tagging and also to silence public discontent about the way that the pandemic was being handled. In Sri Lanka and Thailand, the governments continued to propose harsh laws that would further restrict foreign-funded NGOs. So not surprisingly, funding opportunities have been lost. And that is our third finding. Almost all of the organizations said that some funding was lost, with 48% of them saying that more than 100,000 US dollars were lost, and 16% estimating that they lost more than $1 million US dollars. Funding opportunities were lost during COVID for a variety of reasons. I'm going to touch on a few of them. First was the inability to get registered, and this was a particular problem in India. Unregistered NGOs were providing vital services, but were unable to access these foreign funds. Individuals who had access to foreign donors through professional and personal contacts were unable to bring that money into India. There were donation platforms like Give India, Act Grants, etc., which collected a huge amount of money, but again, unregistered NGOs could not access that money. Then in the middle of that, as I said before, the Indian government also was also cancelling registration. So for example, Oxfam India lost their registration and had to stop vital work such as building oxygen plants, providing life-saving medicines and food, and bridging learning gaps that had happened due to COVID. In the middle of COVID, also prior approvals became a problem. In Pakistan, for example, the National Disaster Management Agency was led by military personnel who refused to grant no objection certificates to organizations that were, for example, advocating for CSOs to provide relief in their communities. Our finding number 4 is that restrictions are preventing collaboration. And this is, again, India is our big example here, because in the first wave of COVID, at the beginning, NGOs collaborated, they got together to help, for example, migrant workers who were stuck on roads when they were forced to go back to their villages. But when the FCRA was amended and the rule against subgranting was brought in, that was basically a death blow for collaboration. One NGO, one interviewee told us about a coalition of 80 NGOs that were working together to provide relief, COVID relief. But as soon as the restriction on subgranting was brought in, that was the end of their work. That coalition collapsed because no donor wants to write 80 checks or enter into 80 agreements. Our next finding is that restrictions are increasing administrative and financial burdens and delaying project implementation. And obviously, this is a particular problem in times of emergency, because not only is there a more urgent use to which funds and resources can be put, but project start dates are being delayed, which makes emergency response very, very difficult. In India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, laws were introduced saying that foreign funds had to be channeled through particular banks only. India and Pakistan actually introduced those laws during COVID. So this was too high a burden for several NGOs to meet. One organization in India was prevented from distributing oxygen concentrators to the government because they couldn't open this bank account. Another one, which had collected millions of dollars for hospital beds, couldn't wire the money into India because the funds were not being cleared. In addition, in terms of administrative and financial burdens, large amounts of information also needed to be provided to the government, even during COVID. So for example, in Pakistan, in order to get approvals, NGOs had to get approvals from more than a dozen government agencies. The agencies were uncoordinated, they were not talking to each other, and in some cases made emergency response impossible. Many NGOs told us that they had to have separate personnel to deal with the administrative and the bureaucracy and the paperwork, and that a lot of their funding and resources had to be diverted to that. Finding number 6 is that restrictions are limiting awareness raising, advocacy, and research. So what we saw during COVID-19 is, yes, NGOs were providing direct services, but they were also doing other things like awareness raising to prevent viral spread, advocating responsiveness and accountability of public expenditure, and advocating for marginalized groups. Now, all of that work is actually very personnel heavy. So resources have to be invested in staff and other personnel costs. But in countries like India, Bangladesh, and Nepal, there are caps on administrative expenses. So only 20% of foreign funds can be used for that, which makes these other awareness raising and advocacy services during emergencies very difficult. Our next finding is that these restrictions are having unintended consequences for service delivery. So most governments defend these laws on the basis that they are necessary to prevent foreign interference in domestic matters, to protect national sovereignty, etc. Most of these laws have broad language which refer to concepts like national security, public morality, undesirable purposes, etc., to curb the activities of NGOs. And all our interviewees told us that these laws are actually directed and implemented mainly vis-a-vis rights-based advocacy groups. However, because the restrictions are broadly applicable, service delivery organizations are also severely impacted. As I said before, the lack of the losing out on foreign funding, the inability to collaborate, the various administrative and financial burdens made it very difficult, even for service delivery organizations, to engage in activities during COVID-19. In addition, many advocacy organizations also engage in service delivery, especially during times of emergency. So, for example, in 2017, Pakistan expelled 29 INGOs, many of which would have been able to provide humanitarian aid during COVID. For example, Plan International, the Marie Stopes Foundation. Again, in India, in 2022, many organizations have been refused their licenses, such as Oxfam India, the Tuberculosis Association, the Ramakrishna Mission, etc. And when these organizations don't have their registrations renewed, they cannot engage in humanitarian aid. And in some cases, like the Special Rapporteur said, these organizations have to stop operations altogether, which brings us to our final finding, that restrictions are having a chilling effect on NGOs. First, there's an existential threat to NGOs. So NGOs in India, for example, are closing down operations. Many interviewees told us that some organizations are unable or unwilling to comply with the very difficult FCRA regulations and are therefore restricting their activities or closing down. In Bangladesh, it seems that some foreign funders are channeling their funds through commercial contractors rather than NGOs in order to avoid these NGO restrictions. In the Philippines, we were told that foreign funders are sometimes afraid to fund certain types of work because they don't want to antagonize the government. Secondly, some NGOs are leaving countries in the region. For example, after Pakistan was put on the Financial Action Task Force grey list, the Pakistani government made the environment so inhospitable that several INGOs left Pakistan. An interviewee in Thailand told us that they have arrangements in place to move money to Korea if and when the new and more restrictive laws are brought into place. Finally, individuals working for NGOs are being silenced. They are self-censoring. They are refusing to speak on certain issues or at certain events, or, for example, put their name on certain types of reports. So those are our main 8 findings, and I guess we are open for questions.
Thank you very much, Natasha and Natalie. Much appreciated for this concise, insightful overview of your findings. And I think the examples and findings speak for themselves. So we have about 11 minutes now for any questions or comments from our attendees. You can feel free to put questions or comments in the chat or use the Q&A function. You can also raise your hand if you would like to make a comment. I think we have one question already in the Q&A, so I'll just read this out and then we can see if anybody would like to jump in. So it's a question from Helena. China's foreign NGO law was not a subject of this research, perhaps because much has been done already. I'm curious as to how much of the new restrictions were inspired by China's example. I believe, however, that someone mentioned India's restrictions began in 2010, so perhaps China was following India's example. In any case, I'm wondering about relationships or information sharing that has led to these restrictions. So I can weigh in on that, but I just want to see if any of our speakers would like to jump in first. Okay, so just okay, yeah, just quickly. That's a great point and comment. And indeed, I think it is clear that we've seen in our research that unfortunately countries regularly copycat bad laws and strategies to restrict civil society, particularly advocacy groups or human rights groups who are criticizing the government. With respect to India and their foreign restriction law, there is a lot of background and history there with the Financial Action Task Force that the Special Rapporteur mentioned, and China, but I think there is a interplay between the big powers in the region. And then we've certainly seen in recent years that many countries are unfortunately following India's example now. For instance, Thailand introduced a very restrictive general nonprofit registration law that had draconian restrictions on foreign funding, and our insight is that that was a direct kind of copy from India because of what happened with amnesty in India as a result of these foreign funding laws. So yeah, I mean, we can certainly provide more information about that, but we do see that type of information sharing in the region. So a question from Benny, is the research also touching on ways that funders are addressing the restrictive situations? Some funders are quite restrictive and cannot cope with how fast restrictive laws are being implemented in these countries. What would the Special Rapporteur's recommendation to funders be on this matter? So Clement, would you like to weigh in on that?
Sorry, Julie, can you come in again?
Yes. So the question is, what are funders doing to address restrictions on foreign funding? And some funders are restrictive and can't deal with how fast the new laws are being implemented. What would your recommendation be to donors on this matter?
Well, as I mentioned, some of the donor practices unintendedly have impact on the restriction on access to resources, and most of the time these are practices. I wouldn't say restriction really. They are the practices that are either informed by some of those challenges the donor are facing because they are working also in restrictive environments. But by taking or by adopting some of those practices, it's end by really deepening or maybe creating additional restriction or additional challenge for access to resources. And one of them being, for example, the whole issue about core funding versus also program funding, which usually can be interpreted in many countries as a way for some donor to be involved in national politics because but also at the same time, it weakens the sustainability of the work of the civil society, which should be protected and which should be guaranteed. I think for me, in general, some of those recommendations that I have in my reports are some of those that I proposing to the donor, but at the same time, like I mentioned to you, I'm currently working on this guideline, which then will really use some of the learning practice, because some donors are doing really well, because some multilateral donors, I don't want to name them here, from my discussion with civil society, have a good practice and know how to deal with this context and have more flexibility. And I think those are practices that we are trying also to leverage. For example, being flexible, trying as much as in those restrictive environments to be more open when it comes to the reporting, which sometimes can also be a source of difficulty for NGOs. And the registration is one that you identify in your reports. And also, I think core funding, but also making sure that the requirements of the form that civil society need to fill in order to access resources also are more adapted. And the whole question that today is the language, because we know in majority, when I speak with many NGOs, most of the donor, big grant making donor will always request you to put your form in English, which we know that the majority of countries where they assist, either they don't speak English, so meaning that it's only small elites that can benefit on that, and excluding majority of those from the grassroots that can benefit from this funding.
Great, thank you so much, Special Rapporteur Boubé. We have just a comment from Linda around multiple sets of laws in place, including in India, that further results in restrictions on NGOs in civic space. And I would just like to reaffirm that, yes, we are tracking all sorts of different laws, not just on foreign funding and access to resources, but the kind of wide array from counterterrorism, security measures, free expression restrictions, online restrictions, and there really is unfortunately a kind of chilling effect and real restriction on the space. We have another question from Jeffrey related to China's NGO and INGO laws, providing a template for these other laws. And as mentioned, I think I'm not aware of how specific that that kind of relationship might be, but I do think that China's model has influenced other models in the region in terms of molding the sector away from advocacy, human rights, environmental, or more controversial issues, gender and other topics, marginalized groups or ethnic minority issues, towards social service and humanitarian activities. Although I do think that there might be an argument to be made that some of the other restrictions put in place by countries more recently just apply so broadly to the entire sector that they're actually really impacting humanitarian and service organizations and not molding the sector to be more service oriented, but just kind of shutting it down. In the recent example in Thailand, I don't believe they mentioned China as one of the countries that they looked to. They did mention India, the UK, and other examples. But I think it is still an important point. So are there other questions? I think we have a couple more minutes. And again, I know we have a lot of knowledge and experience on the call, so feel free to just share comments on your experience or any other questions you'd like to present to our panel. Okay, we have a question from James. What is the panel's view of blended finance with funds being given to private sector actors to facilitate and catalyze green development? Is this another strategy to reduce funds available to CSOs working on these issues? More funds to the private sector and less to local community economic development. Would anyone like to address that?
I wouldn't address that necessarily specifically, but I would say that generally we did have findings that in some of the countries, this diversion away from NGOs is obviously having a negative impact, and towards the for-profit sector is having a negative impact then on the NGOs. So it's sort of like a workaround maybe for funders, but it's not helping civil society itself. And so that was a way that that certain funders, I guess, were getting around the system, but in a way that was not helpful to NGOs. So that's my comment.
Thanks, Natalie. Yes, and just to add on to that, I think in India, again, keep bringing up India, but this trend of the CSR law, first of all, channeling charitable donations from companies in a very specific way, as well as some of the national relief funds, the Prime Minister, the PM Cares Fund, where people and companies can donate directly to the government, for supposed social services, is also channeling resources away from the nonprofit sector. So it's a very interesting dynamic to follow. We also have the trend of nonprofits moving towards social enterprise and becoming blended themselves. Okay, quickly, just Helena's question, where can you find more information on the new regulations in Thailand? We have information on our website, a couple of summary analyses, and then you can email us directly for full analysis of the draft laws. And just wanted to mention Anjuman's comment about NGOs in India actually stopping work and turning to the restaurant business and other professions. So I think with that, we will wrap up since we're at time. Just any last comments from our speakers?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. So, okay, we'll just thank everybody again so much for. Yes.
You want last comments?
Yes, any last comments?
Well, I just want again to thank you, but also I think in my opening statements, I mentioned some of the issues that I feel that they are important, that your research also shows the critical roles that civil society play on the ground, but also how critical the access to resources is important in civil society work. And my report also emphasized that. And today, for me, there is important to really, at the national level, such as the regional level, to continue really to change the narrative, because the whole issue of restriction on access to resources is this type of strategy for many governments also to delegitimize civil society work on the ground in the name of foreign agent, in order really to weaken any dissent and to weaken any criticism on the ground. So it is important in building and trying to push back on this law, to also try also to change the narrative in the sense that what really society needs to understand, how those limitation of access to resources affect their well-being. It affects also their promotion, because we felt that in many times, society is still not really sensitive on what is happening. Some NGO close and there is nothing that happened. People don't understand what is going on. And there is a need really to mobilize society to make sure that to make it costly for any government taking this measure. We need to make them costly, make sure society understand that by putting those restrictions, this is how of support you will not. I was recently in Jordan and many countries. I saw how the restriction of access to resources for some women organizations prevent women to be able to bring cases on the justice. So it is important to expose those things to make it costly. This is what I want to emphasize, and I think this is really the work that should be supported by governments also that understand the value of civil society and their essential role.
Thank you very much, Special Rapporteur. I think with that call to action, we will continue to work on these issues collaboratively. We appreciate very much everybody's contributions. Thank you again to our panelists, Natasha, Natalie, Clement and everybody so much for attending, and we will have a recording available as well, which we will send out. So thank you all again, and hope you have a great rest of your day wherever you may be.
Thank you. Thank you. So great moderation. Thank you, Julie.
Thank you very
Thanks,
much.
everyone.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.